Chapter 1026, Two Restrictions. Upon seeing the young man in the black trench coat appear with a black revolver in hand, Quonus Kilgore, who was no stranger to all the important figures in the world, immediately responded. The thumb on his left hand that held the iron-skinned pocket watch was rapidly moving, reaching for one of the metal buttons on the messy inlays of the pocket watch. He suddenly raised his right arm, aiming at Gehrman's Sparrow with the 6 gray gun barrels that formed a circle. This process was like a fleeting spark that quickly came to an end. As for Quonus Kilgore's left thumb, it had pressed down. Re-ah! He overcame his instinct and didn't directly use restriction from the Concerto of Light and Shadow. This was because he didn't know Gehrman's Sparrow well enough, unsure as to what he was best at. Furthermore, the person with Gehrman's Sparrow's appearance might not be Gehrman's Sparrow. Blindly using restriction would only be a waste of an opportunity. He intended to observe and wait for a while longer before he came up with a more specific order to distort the laws. Bang, 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 bang. The strange revolver let out a roar of despair and spewed out a storm of black and icy bullets, instantly enveloping the enemy beneath the crimson moon. At this moment, Gehrman Sparrow's figure turned transparent and incorporeal. At the same time, the bullets tore through the target in the black trench coat, tearing apart the afterimage he left behind. And behind Quonus Kilgore, Gehrman Sparrow, with a cold expression, quickly appeared. His body was half-crouched, and he was leaning forward. The black top hat on his head appeared blood-red under the crimson moon's illumination. He suddenly raised the black-barreled revolver in his hand, opening his mouth slightly while aiming and squeezing the trigger. Bang! The floorboard to the right of Quonus Kilgore exploded into countless fragments. Gehrman Sparrow's shot had been ridiculously far off the mark. Furthermore, its destructive power was clearly lacking. This was the distortion power of an Earl of the Fallen. It caused the bullet's trajectory to deviate and have its power weakened. Seizing this opportunity, Quonus Kilgore used disorder to influence measurement standards, arriving above the balcony of the bedroom with one step. Then he half-turned his body, and with a smack he pressed one of the metal buttons on his iron-skinned pocket watch. He then solemnly said,
"Teleportation is prohibited here."
Silently, Mager Manor, which was being illuminated by the gigantic crimson moon, experienced an unknown change. Gehrman Sparrow, whose body had rapidly turned faint after firing, appeared out of the void again. He had failed to successfully change positions. Concerto of Light and Shadow. Restriction. To Quonus Kilgore, no matter what Gehrman Sparrow was good at, he had to immediately restrict his obvious ability to teleport. An enemy who could do close-quarters teleportation at a high frequency wasn't only irritating, but also dangerous. Realizing that his teleportation had failed, Gehrman Sparrow's expression remained unperturbed. His body quickly warped as the colors faded from his body, leaving a deep darkness. This deep darkness suddenly collapsed across the ground, fusing with the shadows in the region where the moonlight couldn't reach, making him indistinguishable. Bang! 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 Bullet holes riddled the spot where Gehrman Sparrow was previously standing, tearing the ground open. Boom! The area collapsed immediately, revealing the room before. However, no dust was thrown up, and despite such a stir, Mager Manor remained blanketed in deep shadows. No one was awakened or gave a response. Quonus Kilgore suppressed the urge to restrict the action of hiding in the shadows. Holding on to Reaver's Shout of Despair and Concerto of Light and Shadow, he calmly observed his surroundings and waited for Gehrman Sparrow to appear once again before launching his attack. However, inside the collapsed room, the shadows were silent and there wasn't any movement. And outside the window, the steeple and chimneys remained immersed in icy cold darkness. The gigantic crimson moon seemed to be hanging over the roof. The plants in the garden, the grapevines far away, and all the various classical windows seemed to degenerate into the background on this night. Despite being visible to the naked eye, they were imperturbable. All of Mager Manor was cold, dark, and silent, just like a forgotten corner that didn't garner the attention or incur discovery from others. There were no signs of life at all. As a demigod, as an important figure in the intelligence community, Quonas Kilgore quickly had a theory. He suspected that the person was related to the authority of concealment. This gave him many ideas, but Gearman Sparrow remained nowhere to be seen.
He actually didn't sneak attack, and even gave up the chance to deliver a barrage of attacks, leaving me so many openings. Doesn't he know that a high-sequence lawyer or arbiter is very difficult to deal with once they're prepared prior to the battle?
A sense of puzzlement flashed across Quonas Kilgore's mind. Using his observations of his surroundings and the relatively non-urgent situation, he quickly understood his current predicament. He knew that defeating Gearman Sparrow wasn't key, but escaping the concealed world was. If he couldn't leave this place, there might be more dangers awaiting him.
As long as I can leave this dark-styled Magor Manor, even if angels were to descend, I don't have to worry, since I'm in Backland. Such artificial concealed worlds must have an opening. This is a law that cannot be avoided in the mysterious world. The usage and distortion of laws was what lawyer pathway demigods were best at.
Quonas Kilgore had many ideas come to him as he quickly made a decision. He suddenly turned around and jumped from the balcony, flying off like he was a spring that was released. This demigod of the military instantly reached a high altitude. But he didn't slow down or show any signs of falling. He maintained this speed as he went higher and higher in altitude, thus achieving flight. Earl of the Fallen, exploit. This was the exploitation of laws. By extending the jumping process, he could maintain a much longer duration. If Quonas Kilgore became a Sequence 2 angel, he could even jump onto the Crimson Moon with this beyonder power. While jumping in midair, Quonas Kilgore swung his right arm and released his disorder beyonder power. He wanted to create a certain level of disorder in Magor Manor in this strange world. The true exit would then be exposed through the generated ripples. Instantly, the flowers and grapevines in the background of Magor Manor wavered. The black steeple, chimneys, and classical windows were covered in a faint shadow. In the entire world, only the gigantic crimson moon, which appeared to be right before them, didn't change. It continued hanging silently in the sky.
That's the exit.
Quonas Kilgore grasped the patterns from the disorder, and using some actual feedback, he determined where the exit was. Without any hesitation, he exerted strength in his waist and used Magnify to forcefully change his direction, allowing him to rush towards the bright red moon. At that moment, a figure appeared in front of Magor Manor. It was none other than the cold-looking Gearman Sparrow, who wore a black trench coat and half-top hat. Whoosh! A strong gust of wind appeared out of nowhere, sweeping Gearman Sparrow upwards as he chased after Quonas Kilgore. Amidst the wind, he raised the iron-black revolver in his right hand and pulled the trigger. Bang! A bullet flew out, exploding into countless fragments. They then turned into a storm that swept towards Quonas Kilgore. Death knell. Slaughter. It was a barrage of attacks. Almost at the same time, Quonas Kilgore changed direction without any warning, plummeting instead of rushing towards the moon. As a result, he dodged the bullet storm's assault as though he was prepared for it. No, it wasn't the case. He was prepared. Although his main goal was to escape the changed Magor Manor, he was still worried that Gearman Sparrow would seize the opportunity to attack him. Therefore, he came up with a simple trap, planning to use his escape as bait to fish out the hiding Gearman Sparrow. He could then take the initiative to heavily injure his opponent, Urithakur. Halfway down, Quonas Kilgore's figure suddenly bounced back, having distorted the direction he was heading in. This time, his destination was the next point where Gearman Sparrow was flying towards. Right on the heels of that, he yanked his pocket watch-wielding left hand back and grabbed Gearman Sparrow through thin air, pulling him from a distance of nearly 100 meters away to just inches before him. Earl of the Fallen. Magnify. Whoosh! Amidst the howling winds, Quonas Kilgore grabbed Gearman Sparrow's clothes and pressed his strange revolver in his right hand forward. Bang, 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 bang. Rever's shout of despair released countless bullets like a machine gun, instantly tearing Gearman Sparrow's body into fluttering pieces of paper. Conus Kilgore's gaze froze slightly as he immediately moved his left finger and pressed one of the metal buttons on his pocket watch. With a click, this Earl of the Fallen didn't hesitate to say in a domineering fashion,
"Stand-ins are prohibited here."
Just as he said that, the howling wind came to a stop. Maegor Manor returned to silence once again as it was blanketed by dark shadows. Conus Kilgore changed direction and began spiraling in midair in search of Gehrman Sparrow. However, there weren't any anomalies in the dark night sky. This Earl of the Fallen hesitated for a moment before preparing to continue rushing towards the gigantic crimson moon. At this moment, figures appeared in the garden, vineyard, and manor's main building. They either grew or became taller, rapidly taking form. They all had black hair and brown eyes with sharp facial features. They wore silk top hats and black trench coats. They were all Gehrman Sparrows. The only difference was that some of them were of normal build, some with their backs sunk inwards. The rest were bloated, while others just a thin layer. Upon seeing this scene, Conus Kilgore immediately recalled a dangerous enemy he had once encountered. One of the leaders of Intis's intelligence department, a bizarro sorcerer. Chapter 1027, Deceit. After Conus Kilgore realized which Beyonder pathway his enemy belonged to, all the Gehrman Sparrows in the garden, vineyard, and main building raised their left hand. They curled their middle finger, ring finger, and pinky, extending their index finger and thumb, making them take on the simple shape of a gun. The index fingers that represented barrels and muzzles aimed at Conus Kilgore in the air before their respective arms jerked up, seemingly due to the recoil. Bang, 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 bang. Amidst deafening noises, illusory doves appeared to the side of the Earl of the Fallen, who was dressed in a white shirt and black trousers. They flew at him from every direction in a spectacular sight of utmost beauty. This was the random anomaly that came about from the iron-skinned pocket watch and concerto of light and shadow. It made the air cannons which could blast through houses turn into doves of peace that didn't pose any threat. Having used disorder to disrupt the enemy's collective volley, Conus Kilgore wasn't surprised to see the doves fly up and disperse into the air. He was already mentally prepared. He had already endured the negative effects that the sealed artifact had brought for years. Taking advantage of this opportunity, he didn't hesitate to raise his hands, which held the iron-skinned pocket watch and revolver, doing so in a bid to make them collide. This was distortion, one that targeted all the Gehrman Sparrows beneath him. To Conus Kilgore, what frustrated him the most when fighting a bizarro sorcerer was that he was unable to tell if the enemy he faced was a marionette or the actual person, unless the marionette was of a very crude level. As such, he had many Beyonder powers he didn't dare use because they were ineffective against marionettes. A large-scale prohibition effect was still all right, but a single target deprivation was meaningless in actual combat. No matter how many Beyonder powers of a marionette were deprived, it didn't affect the actual body. When that happened, his opponent just needed to switch marionettes to resolve the problem. Due to similar reasons, using Magnify on the mystical items on the marionettes was temporarily written off by Conus Kilgore for strategic purposes. Similarly, an Earl of the Fallen's bestowment was of no use. It was even inferior to deprivation, as it could cause a bizarro sorcerer's marionette to lose its corresponding Beyonder powers. However, the negative effects bestowed to a marionette was unable to interfere with it at all. Be it turning them sluggish, losing the will to fight, making them turn anxious, or only focus on money, it was meaningless to a marionette who was, in essence, dead, without any ability to think or inclinations to take action. Therefore, Conus Kilgore decided to first resolve the problem of identifying marionettes and the actual body. In this aspect, others might not have a solution, but a high-sequence Beyonder of the lawyer pathway definitely didn't have such worries. There were rules to everything, and everything followed certain rules. As a lawyer demigod, they were good at finding whatever loopholes there were to exploit them for themselves. Together with his combat experience fighting other bizarro sorcerers and how he had seriously considered solutions for dealing with them during the aftermath, Conus Kilgore was quite certain that distortion could suppress his enemy. He knew that bizarro sorcerers could seamlessly switch between their actual body and marionettes. He planned on distorting this, making the bizarro sorcerer only be able to switch to 2 to 3 marionettes. This way, the difficulty of identifying the actual body and the marionette would be minimized. Of course, if it wasn't for the fact that distortion couldn't exceed certain limits, and area-oriented prohibition effects had reached its limit, Conus Kilgore definitely would have used a simpler method to deal with his opponent, such as forcing the bizarro sorcerer to only be able to swap with one marionette, or he would prohibit swapping with marionettes. Pa! Conus Kilgore smashed the Reaver's Shout of Despair and Concerto of Light and Shadow together as though he was compressing a large area to a small area. Earl of the Fallen, Distortion. Silently, he produced a red glow with a deep shadow in his hand. It appeared as though he was offering it to the Gehrman sparrows in the garden, vineyard, and main building. As for the thick and thin, normal, or terrifying crazy adventurers, none of them experienced any abnormalities. Conus Kilgore also suffered a random anomaly, one brought about by Concerto of Light and Shadow. It had changed the distortion effects to summoning a flower from the garden below. And at that moment, the air cannons that had turned into illusory doves continued. At that moment, the battle between two demigods turned ludicrous, comical, and funny. Of course, be it Gehrman Sparrow or Conus Kilgore, none of them thought that was the case, especially the latter. He once again felt a familiar sense of helplessness. He didn't hesitate as he slammed his palms together again, completing the distortion. He wanted to rely on quantity to resist the random anomaly effect. However, Gehrman Sparrow wasn't a dead person who would abide by the etiquette of turn-based combat. The large swath of crazy adventurers either raised their hands in firing stances or used a death knell with questionable authenticity, aiming at the Earl of the Fallen in midair. Meanwhile, Conus Kilgore's heart stirred. He turned his head slightly to look up and saw that a figure had appeared once again inside the gigantic crimson moon that hung above the black steeple. The figure was wearing a silk top hat, a black trench coat, a human skin glove, and an iron black revolver. He had a cold expression and a deep outline. He was another Gehrman Sparrow. The crimson moon seemed to weigh down on his shoulders as he glided down, his body expanding and turning clearer in the process. As for the iron-black, long-barreled revolver in his hand, he had already lifted it and aimed it at Conus Kilgore. Bang! Bang! A bullet that had transparent and translucent sections to it shot out from the muzzle, heading straight for Conus Kilgore. This was a deprivation bullet, one which was created using a worm of time that Eamon's avatar had left behind. It was different from an Arbiter Pathways deprivation. In essence, it was theft. It could steal the last 3 Beyonder powers the target had used, and become empowered with the ability to use them. However, as long as the Arbiter Pathways deprivation selected a target, then they could directly deprive them of their ability. Although this bullet's deprivation effect didn't require contact in order to be effective, the target needed to be within a certain range and unable to leave the area. In short, one was unavoidable and could only be resisted or weakened through one's level or sequence's characteristics, while the other could effectively be dodged if the shot was detected ahead of time. Klein had given up on a sneak attack and had stalled for time because, on the one hand, he wanted Conus Kilgore to use up all his prohibition and deprivation powers on Beyonder powers that appeared important to him. On the other hand, he was also waiting for the first random anomaly to happen. Then he would seize the gap in between the 2 anomalies to steal Conus Kilgore's 3 most powerful powers with the deprivation bullet. For these 2 goals, he even handed Death Knell and Creeping Hunger to Winner Inuni and made him appear like the real Gehrman Sparrow instead of a marionette. From the current developments, Conus Kilgore was about to lose Distortion, Disorder, and Magnify. Bang, 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 bang. The Gehrman Sparrows underneath collectively fired shots. Suddenly, the air cannons and the deprivation bullet exploded, turning into red, purple, yellow, or green fireworks. However, they were unable to illuminate the deep, dark sky. Concerto of Light and Shadow had once again created a random anomaly. It had produced its effects several times in a row without any pauses or delays. Conus Kilgore immediately smiled and slammed his hands together again. All of a sudden, the young men wearing silk top hats and black trench coats under the gigantic crimson moon's illumination turned gloomy. Only two maintained their previous states. The Earl of the Fallen's distortion had taken effect. This meant that German Sparrow could only switch places with those two normal marionettes. Right on the heels of that, Cuance Kilgore didn't hesitate at all. He swung his arm and threw out the flower that was held together with the pocket watch-out. The flower sped up and seemed to gain weight of unknown origins. Like an arrow, it shot towards one of the normal marionettes. This attack had been magnified and also came with the effects of bribe. Weaken! Boom! The flower was like a cannon that crashed heavily into the ground, causing a violent quake. The surging waves it stirred up threw up the ordinary and unordinary humans in the vicinity, tearing or severely injuring them. The two marionettes which German Sparrow could swap with had been reduced to pieces of meat. Cuance Kilgore maintained his calm. As he distorted his trajectory in midair and circled the area while in flight, he raised River's shout of despair and aimed it at the German Sparrow that had descended from the crimson moon. At the same time, he silently prepared a bestowment. He wanted to give his target the negative state of lacking the will to fight. But at that moment, Cuance Kilgore's mind suddenly turned adrift as his thoughts turned sluggish.
This, turning into a marionette.
Cuance Kilgore's mental state stiffened as he understood his current situation. He then saw that German Sparrow, who had descended from the crimson moon, wasn't as far away from him as before. The distance between them was only about 100 meters. He had unknowingly entered the range where spirit body threads could be controlled. He had stayed there for at least 3 seconds without realizing it. Deceit! A deceit bullet made from Eamon's avatar. When Klein, who was actually Winner NE, had pulled the trigger, he hadn't only fired a deprivation bullet, but had actually fired twice. This was to prevent any random anomalies from happening. With an anomaly having happened once, even if another anomaly were to happen, only one of the 2 bullets that had been fired in intervals that were slightly spaced apart would be affected. After all, it was an intermittent random anomaly. It was possible to have it happen 2 to 3 times consecutively, but 4 or 5 consecutive occurrences were rare. Therefore, by attacking numerous times, there would be at least 1 or more instances that wouldn't suffer an anomaly. Just now, the firing of the second deceit bullet had been concealed by the collective volley from the marionettes. This was also why Klein made Winner and Nooney use Death Knell. It was to rely on his luck. Finally, he successfully deceived Cuance Kilgore and allowed Winner and Nooney to secretly enter a safe distance of 150 meters from him and begin controlling his spirit body threads and obtained initial control. The moment this began, it meant that the Beyonder power was taking effect. Since there weren't any anomalies, it meant that there wouldn't be any more. Chapter 1028, Saving Himself. No good. My spirit body threads have been controlled by him. Having met faceless Beyonders, marionettists, or bizarro sorcerers, and even fighting senior Beyonders and demigods, Cuance Kilgore wasn't unfamiliar with the predicament he was in. He was even rather familiar with it and knew quite a bit. Therefore, he knew very well that he had fallen into a lethal trap. The time he had left to save himself didn't exceed 15 seconds. And in these 15 seconds, his thoughts would turn more and more sluggish, and the speed at which he could come up with solutions would slow down. Towards the end, just the thought of a solution would take him several seconds. Yet, his stiff and dull body would require plenty of time to actualize his thoughts. This also meant that he had about 10 seconds to save himself. Of course, he had considered the corresponding response for the last few seconds. It was to abandon his body's control and reveal his mythical creature form. Through this, he could delay the time it took to become a marionette and then use his existence to disrupt the enemy, dealing a blow to them to a certain extent. However, by doing so, even if he escaped the fate of becoming a marionette and even managed to defeat his enemy, Cuance Kilgore didn't have much confidence in continuing to live. He wasn't a demigod who could freely switch between his human form and mythical creature form. He didn't have the confidence that he could maintain his rationale in a mythical creature form. In other words, the outcome of escaping the fate of becoming a marionette by releasing his mythical creature form likely meant that the human Cunis Kilgore would die, while a monster of the same name would occupy his body. Because of that outcome, Cunis Kilgore wouldn't make such an attempt unless it was necessary. While his thoughts weren't too sluggish, and with how he could hear River's shout of despair in his ears, this demigod of the military quickly came up with his first plan to save himself. He moved his right thumb at a speed that couldn't be considered slow. Earl of the Fallen, magnify. Cunis Kilgore didn't wish to magnify a particular state of his or the attack of a particular sealed artifact. Instead, it was used to magnify Reaver's shout of despair's side effects. This special revolver allowed the wielder to hear the roar of despair from time to time. A rather serious blow to creatures without godhood, easily pushing them to the brink of losing control, to madness, to a mental breakdown or mind blanking. And at sequence 4, the effects of the roar was greatly mitigated once his body possessed the characteristics of a mythical creature. To Cunis Kilgore, this roar was enough to turn his mind adrift and generate irascible mood swings. It didn't have much of an effect on him, and he had already gotten used to it. And at that moment, he wanted to magnify the roar of despair to a state where even a demigod wouldn't be able to tolerate it. He wanted to use the pain that came from this psychic piercing in his mind to escape the state of having his spirit-body threads being controlled. As Magnify didn't need any obvious actions, it was quick to show its effects. Opposite him, Gehrman Sparrow, who held Death Knell and wore a half-top hat, was floating in mid-air with strong gusts of wind swirling around him. He didn't make it in time to stop the Earl of the Fallen from successfully using this beyonder power. But in the next second, what Cunis Kilgore met in response wasn't a terrifying roar, but silence. The ordinary roar that was originally present had vanished. This was a random anomaly brought about by the concerto of light and shadow. Cunis Kilgore's thoughts slowly flashed past his mind. He didn't have the luxury of time to feel disheartened, as he immediately made a second attempt.
Seriously, how unlucky.
He raised his right hand in an unsteady manner, aiming Revere's shout of despair at Gehrman Sparrow, who stood 150 meters from him and was about to pull the trigger. At the same moment, the strong winds that blew at his right hand suddenly disintegrated in an inward fashion, turning into scattered eddies. Earl of the Fallen, disorder. Cunis had used this to withstand Gehrman Sparrow's interference. Following that, there was a series of thumping sounds. Like a machine gun, Reaver's shout of despair spewed out dangerous bullets without stopping. Gehrman Sparrow's black trench coat-covered body jerked repeatedly, but he wasn't hit. The bullets grazed his outline and flew into the distance, shattering the windows and walls, causing one of the buildings to collapse in silence. Bang, 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 bang! The subsequent bullet storm continued their barrage, and finally, Gehrman Sparrow was struck repeatedly. Amidst splattering blood, Gehrman Sparrow kept struggling and shaking in the strong gust of winds like a paper figurine, looking as though he was about to tear apart at any moment. Bang, bang, bang! The strange revolver finally stopped its roar, and apart from his head, Gehrman Sparrow was riddled with nasty, gaping holes. Typically speaking, this was definitely a state that only the dead had. However, Gehrman Sparrow continued controlling the spirit-body threads as though he was unaffected. The ridiculous wounds on his body slowly but resolutely healed. This was the effect of Flower of Blood. This Gehrman Sparrow was actually Enuni. The reason why he didn't die in that storm-like attack was because he had released all his accumulated luck. It was also because Cunis Kilgore was sufficiently unlucky, and the roar of despair that the bullets brought forth was nothing to a marionette. Seeing that the violent attack failed to achieve the desired effect, and that the amount of time he had left to save himself dwindled, Cunis Kilgore followed his thought-out plan and slowly relaxed his 5 left fingers without any thought. The iron-skinned pocket watch left his palm and dropped to the ground. At such a critical moment, Cunis Kilgore decisively gave up the concerto of light and shadow and made it stay far away from the battlefield so as to avoid the effects of its random anomalies. Next, he might only have one or two chances to save himself. If another anomaly were to happen, the outcome was irreversible. The sealed artifact, which was a mixture of half-order and disorder, quickly plummeted to the ground. Kunas Kilgore moved his fingers with great difficulty as he faced Gehrman Sparrow, whose wounds were quickly healing. He originally had two choices. One was to use the third method he had originally thought of to save himself, an action that only required a mere thought. The other was to magnify his enemy's injuries and make him die on the spot. However, when Kunas Kilgore was still able to think relatively quickly, he didn't expect Gehrman Sparrow to not die after suffering so many gunshots. Even his control over the spirit body threads wasn't affected. There was no subsequent follow-up to this plan. We agree. And at this moment his brain was already like a sluggish mush. He had no way of thinking too much. He didn't wish to waste any more time as he followed his plans. Whoosh! Around Gehrman Sparrow, who wore a transparent glove and iron-black revolver, the strong gusts of winds that held him up suddenly intensified and sent him flying up high. Whoosh! With the help of the strong winds, Gehrman Sparrow raced to the pitch-black sky under the watch of the gigantic crimson moon. Earl of the Fallen. Magnify. The strong winds that helped Gehrman Sparrow fly had been magnified into a hurricane. This way, the distance between him and Kunas Kilgore would stretch beyond 150 meters. That would terminate the process of turning the latter into a marionette. Seeing his goal achieved, Kunas Kilgore, who had yet to regain his freedom, had his expression turn complicated bit by bit. The hurricane rapidly expanded and swept over to him, engulfing him and throwing him high into the sky. It made it impossible for the distance between him and Gehrman Sparrow to open up. He was truly unlucky. Under the night sky, amidst the moonlight, the two figures became smaller. Soon, the hurricane returned to normal as their momentum slowly diminished. Seizing this opportunity, Kunas Kilgore's nearly frozen mind had another idea.
Stop.
He stopped maintaining his power of flight and used gravity to plummet down like a meteor, doing so in order to rapidly open up a distance from Gehrman Sparrow. Then he ignored Gehrman Sparrow's ability to control the wind and pursue him. He slowly pulled his left arm in front of his body like it was filled with rust. It was the action of closing a door. He wanted to use an Earl of the Fallen's distortion to create a wall-like seal in the air, putting an obstacle between Gehrman Sparrow and him, so that he couldn't carry out his pursuit. At that moment, the marionettes, the Gehrman Sparrows who were still alive underneath him, raised their left arms and made the gesture of firing a gun. Bang! 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 Bullets shot out, enveloping Kunas Kilgore in midair. After the shockwaves dispersed, Kunas Kilgore was covered with several bloody holes. Due to the pain and the jolting of his body from the first few bullets striking him, he had finally snapped out of the state of having his spirit-body threads being controlled. The speed of his thoughts rapidly recovered. Following that, he disordered the subsequent volley at the critical moment and distorted his injuries, preventing himself from dying. All he suffered were serious injuries. And Gehrman Sparrow, who had many mystical items and was swooping down from above, he was obstructed by the invisible wall. He failed to catch up. With another distortion, Kunas Kilgore's descent speed slowed down as he gently landed on the ground. Before he could do anything else, his body froze again as he stood stiffly on the spot. He felt that his hands and feet were resisting him and not listening to his commands. He felt that there was an unfamiliar object hiding in his body. Then he saw a figure walk out of Magor Manor's master bedroom, under the gigantic crimson moon's illumination, and stand on the balcony. He had black hair and brown eyes, wearing a silk top hat and a black trench coat. His facial features were pronounced, and he was another Gehrman Sparrow. This Gehrman Sparrow's right hand had the gesture of firing a gun. He then pulled back his hand and blew at it. Mooing. That was Klein himself. Mooing. What he shot out wasn't an air bullet, but a parasite bullet delivered with an air bullet's might. It was a parasite bullet created from a worm of time that Amon's avatar had left behind. It could create a worm of time that couldn't live too long, allowing it to parasitize the target and be controlled by the user. Klein had deliberately taken out the bullet and held it in his hand, specifically to wait for this opportunity. He was waiting for Cunis Kilgore to throw away Concerto of Light and Shadow and not have the ability to dodge or use distortion. The former was predictable when the Earl of the Fallen's spirit body threads reached the state of initially being control. This was because he couldn't allow the random anomalies to influence his attempts to save himself, and the latter was all about patience. Just moments ago, his patience had paid off. A chance appeared. Klein was the first to raise his hand and shoot. Maha-ha. Without the random anomalies affecting the outcome, he had accurately shot a parasite bullet into Cunis Kilgore's body. If the thing that had previously taken effect wasn't a deceit bullet, but a deprivation bullet, then the strategy would be different. Briefly unable to control his body, Cunis Kilgore looked at the Gairman Sparrow on the balcony, remove his top hat, press his hand to his chest, and bow slightly at him under the gigantic crimson moon. As Gairman Sparrow's trench coat fluttered, his thoughts had turned sluggish. Chapter 1029, Ruins Number 1.
No.
A strong feeling of despair emerged in Cunis Kilgore's heart as he stood on the spot. As a military demigod who had experienced many dangers, he had a clear understanding of his current situation. He could already hear the footsteps of death approaching him. He wanted to struggle and risk it by revealing his mythical creature form, but his orders didn't do a thing with his sluggish mind. His body had been parasitized and was no longer under his control. At that moment, Cunis Kilgore wasn't even capable of shedding a tear. Under the gigantic crimson moon's illumination, 1 second after another passed. Suddenly, Cunis Kilgore raised his left hand and touched his crew haircut. He had already become Klein's marionette. In fact, he still had a chance at the final moment. As the parasite effect didn't last long enough for him to become a marionette, he had those 2 or 3 seconds to reveal his mythical creature form. But the problem was that his body also had the effects of misdirection and deceit. As time passed, his thoughts turned more and more sluggish and wasn't able to grasp that short opportunity. Klein looked at his new marionette and exhaled silently. He looked up at the clear and bright red moon and said,
"It's done."
Amidst the gigantic crimson moon, a black dot instantly appeared and descended from the sky. It was none other than the Church of Evemite's Archbishop, servant of concealment, Ariana, who wore a simple robe with tree bark as a belt. In this concealed world, this ascetic didn't use any beyond her powers to float in midair. She cast her eyes at the Earl of the Fallen beneath. She gently raised her right hand, as Cunis Kilgore's slightly blurry soul emerged from the military demigod's head. Klein lost his control over his marionette as a result of this. He wasn't too surprised by this because he hadn't sent a worm of spirit through the spirit body threads over. His control over the marionette was essentially still at a sequence 5 state and not at the demigod level. Ariana asked calmly as she looked at Cunis Kilgore's soul.
"Where did you go just now?"
Cunis Kilgore's expression twisted slightly before replying,
Ruins Number 1.
Is this a contractual promise or a psychological cue?
Klein, who watched the spirit channeling from the side, sensed something from the Earl of the Fallen's reaction. However, this didn't affect anything because they were in a concealed world, one which no one knew of or could sense. As an archbishop of the Evernight goddess and an angel of the corresponding pathway, Ariana shared a certain amount of authority in concealment. Therefore, she didn't start with the simplest questions but went straight to the point.
"Where is that ruin? Who did it once belong to? What is it being used for?"
She wasn't afraid of any accidents. Cunis Kilgore's soul trembled slightly as he exuded a feeling as if he would automatically blow up, but ultimately, nothing happened. He hesitantly replied,
That ruin is located deep underground at the Sturluin segment of the Tussock River. It has a setup that interferes with the powers of divination and prophecy.
Sturluin segment. This is quite far from the mountain where Mr. A was at, and where you disappeared from. From the looks of it, you were very cautious. That point-to-point teleports effects are greater than I expected.
Klein quickly conjured a picture of the terrain of Backland's northwestern outskirts. Cornus Kilgore continued replying.
That ruin used to belong to Blood Emperor Alista Tudor. I'm not sure what it's currently used for. I am unable to enter the depths of the ruins and am only in charge of sending in people and materials acquired via various means.
The name Blood Emperor Alista Tudor made Ariana fall silent. About 3 seconds later, she asked,
What materials did you acquire?
This time, Cornus Kilgore didn't put up much of a resistance. He listed them down, including large amounts of mercury, iron ore, and ritual materials of different domains. Klein was unable to obtain any effective information from that because it was too well-rounded. It was possible to do anything.
They really are very careful, using large amounts of sundries to hide what they're truly searching for. Even the demigod in charge of these matters isn't aware of the reason. This is very in line with the way a spectator pathway beyonder works. It was designed by the psychology alchemists.
Klein nodded indiscernibly with a guess in mind. Ariana didn't seem to notice anything as she asked,
Do you have any guesses on what they're doing? If so, what?
Yes, I suspect that they're digging up something and attempting to make sacrifices.
Cornus Kilgore voiced out his judgment. Ariana silently looked down at him for a while and said,
Who got you involved in the underground ruins? Who are the people who can enter the depths of the ruins?
Cornus Kilgore struggled once again, but there were no anomalies. He said hesitantly,
I received His Majesty's orders. I was able to become a demigod because he provided me with the formulas, ingredients, and the opportunity. He even bestowed me with the Concerto of Light and Shadow, allowing me to act as a Sequence 5 Beyonder, even in situations where I can't hide my strength. Apart from His Majesty entering the depths of the ruins, only 2 other demigods of the royal family can enter. One of them is Prince Grove, and the other is Duchess Georgina.
They both have Augustus as their last names. But the royal family doesn't only have 2 demigods. Miss Justice doesn't know much of these 2, and mentioned that they seldom participate in social events. Even their seats as House of Lords Member of Parliaments are given to their children. Yes, at the demigod level, even if they lack the beyonder characteristics of not dying and not aging, it wouldn't be a problem living for more than 100 years. It's really not suitable for them to hold official posts and repeatedly appear in public.
Klein tried hard to recall, but he failed to gather anything else. Ariana was silent for a few seconds before suddenly asking,
Have you met Corins in the underground ruins?
Who is he?
Cornus Kilgore asked in confusion. Ariana didn't answer and continued asking.
Besides them, who else have you met in the underground ruins?
Cornus Kilgore maintained his sluggish state, which was characteristic of spirit channeling.
People from the demonist sect and psychology alchemists. The former was originally represented by Despair Nightingale Panatia, but was changed to Saintess of White Catarina. The latter is Hvin Rambis.
Ariana asked meticulously.
Did they enter the depths of the underground ruins?
I don't know, I wasn't following them all the time.
Cornus Kilgore shook his head.
At least when I met them, they were all in the periphery.
Ariana asked other questions in an attempt to draw out the general outline of the matter via other angles. However, it was obvious that George III's arrangements were flawless. Even a demigod like Cornus Kilgore only knew about the mission that he was responsible for and could only move about in designated regions. He was unable to learn more. After some thought, Ariana flipped up her right hand and gently pressed down, pushing Cornus Kilgore's soul back into his body. Klein's control over his marionette was restored. This made Klein sigh inwardly.
The authority of concealment is really impressive. Even if Ma'am Ariana were to question my marionette one day, I wouldn't even know.
At this moment, Ariana turned her body and spoke to Gehrman Sparrow on the balcony.
A problem with George III has basically been confirmed, as well as where the underground ruins are. I will immediately meet with the archbishops of the Church of Storms and Church of Steam, convincing them to take action tonight and opening the ruins. Before I inform you, control Cuanus Kilgore and pretend that everything is fine before making him vanish.
Are you worried that the enemy will notice a problem with Cunas Kilgore while negotiating with the Church of Storms and Church of Steam, making it so that they can seal off the underground ruins or activate other emergency plans?
Klein had a general understanding of the matter and nodded.
No problem.
Ariana, who didn't have adorned hair, didn't speak further. With a casual wave of her hand, the iron-skinned pocket watch flew over.
This sealed artifact was bestowed by George III. Perhaps we might be able to find some clues from its origins.
Does that mean you're taking it away?
Klein replied without any objection.
I'll leave it to you.
He really didn't have any complaints about that, and he even believed that it was only right. After all, half of the battle's success was due to Ariana's contribution with the concealed world and blessing him with misfortune. In the event that she didn't take the Concerto of Light and Shadow, Klein would mention it. When it came to matters like this, he was always just. And the Concerto of Light and Shadow was the spoils of war that he didn't want the most. This was because it was at complete odds with his combat style as a bizarro sorcerer. The random anomalies would affect him, and the weakening effect was something worse than the enemy. If Klein's spoils of war from this matter was the pocket watch, then he had considered tricking. No, promoting it to the snake of fate will Septon. Only a life school of thought demigod who relied on luck to survive could commandeer the Concerto of Light and Shadow. And when that happens with such a huge secret organization and a sequence one, they definitely had powerful sealed artifacts that could be used to trade for it. Upon receiving his reply, Ariana gently nodded. She then threw the iron-skinned pocket watch back at Cuanus Kilgore, making the Earl of the Fallen look no different from before. Her figure vanished as though it had been erased by an eraser. Even the pitch-black world, with the gigantic crimson moon hanging in the sky, the steeple and chimneys were quickly wiped away. In the blink of an eye, everything returned to normal. Klein was inside the master bedroom, and Cuanus Kilgore was in a guest room tens of meters away. Clenched tightly in his hand was Rever's shout of despair. Then, this Brigadier General of MI9 used disorder to place the revolver back into his underarm holster and pick up the mager wine he had previously poured out and took a sip. Chapter 1030, Joint Operations. Backland, North Borough, St. Samuel Cathedral. The Cardinal of the Church of Storms, Archbishop of the Backland Diocese, deep blue efficient Randall Valentinus, descended amidst the wind, landing inside the steeple with a huge clock to the left. He donned a black robe with a storm symbol and had thick facial hair. His hair was short and stood up, colored in a dark blue that was almost black. This muscular demigod cast his gaze to the other side and said to the figure who was already waiting there,
Horemek, do you know what happened? Why did Anthony suddenly invite us over here?
The person he spoke to was dressed in a white priest robe and a clergyman's bonnet. He had a genial and mild expression, and he was none other than the Church of Steam's Divine Council member, Archbishop of the Backland Diocese, the demigod Horemek Haydn. Upon hearing Randall's question, Horemek calmly replied,
I didn't arrive here much earlier than you. In fact, I only left the laboratory for a few minutes.
He wasn't only a clergyman, but also a famous scientist. He was an emeritus professor at Backland University's physics department. Randall Valentinus was just about to say something when he suddenly saw a figure walk up the narrow spiral staircase and arrive at the peak in the darkness that the crimson moon wasn't able to illuminate. This figure was dressed in a black clergyman robe with red accents. By his chest hung 5 dark sacred emblems. He was clean-shaven, and his eyes were deep, dark, and tranquil. He was none other than one of the 13 archbishops of the Church of Evernight, Backland Diocese person in charge, St. Anthony Stevenson.
Is there something that can't wait until daybreak? Or do people from the Church of Evernight enjoy discussing matters at night?
Deep blue efficient, Randall Valentinus asked. Oh, no. No Mumalan. Anthony came to a stop after walking up the flight of stairs and said with a serious expression,
A very pressing matter.
What is it?
Randall asked immediately. At this moment, Hormick Hayden also cast his gaze at Anthony Stevenson, awaiting his answer. In similar situations, Hormick especially liked the existence of people from the Church of Storms. This meant that they would take the initiative to ask questions, and that there was no need to be euphemistic. It didn't require him to say anything else. Anthony looked at them separately and said,
It's related to the royal family. I'll let Ma'am Ariana do the honors.
Just as he said that, a barefoot, bun-haired female figure in a simple robe with tree bark for a belt quickly outlined itself out of the shadows. Upon seeing this figure, Randall and Hormick immediately bowed.
Good evening, Ma'am Ariana.
Their expressions turned solemn at the same time, for they had a deep understanding of how important and crucial the matter that was happening tonight was. It was definitely not a small matter for a grounded angel to appear. Meanwhile, they couldn't help but be roused up. They realized that they had no idea when this matron of the Evernight cloister, the servant of concealment, Ma'am Ariana, had arrived in Backland. Under normal circumstances, the three churches, the royal family, and the military enjoyed a certain degree of tacit cooperation. Grounded angels and Grade 0 sealed artifacts wouldn't appear in Backland.
Good evening, Archbishops.
Ariana answered without any signs of haughtiness. She then raised her right hand and grasped onto thin air. A faint light was emitted as it transformed into a scene along with the darkness. It was the entire conversation between Ariana and Cronus Kilgore. This secret that appeared to have been kept for quite some time had finally presented itself before others. As they watched, Deep Blue Efficient Randall Valentinus couldn't help but say,
He actually advanced to Sequence 4 and became a demigod.
This Archbishop knew Cronus Kilgore. He originally believed that this deputy director of MI9 was only a Sequence 5 and had relied on a sealed artifact with severe negative effects to obtain combat strength at the demigod level. He never expected it to be a disguise. The Church of Storms' influence on the military was greater than the two major churches. No one answered Randall. After the secret was fully revealed, Hormick said,
One involves a secret ruin of the Blood Emperor, and with large numbers of people sent in. These 2 points put together cannot be anything good. Indeed. Let's head to the ruins now.
Randall nodded in agreement. Ariana looked around and calmly said,
This involves the royal family and the king. It's best if you seek permission from your own Holy See.
In this angel's choice of words, the Holy See referred to their respective churches' headquarters, the core seat of power of the church.
All right.
The two archbishops replied without any hesitation. After a while, Deep Blue Efficient Randall Valentinus and Hormick Hayden received feedback from the sealed artifacts they carried. Together with Anthony Stevenson and Ariana, they headed for the Blood Emperor ruins that Cronus Kilgore had previously entered. Ariana then took out an iron-black coat of arms with complicated symbols, and she tried to activate it. She didn't make any disguise attempt, and she stood there calmly, as though she wasn't worried that the guards in the ruins would recognize her. Seeing this servant of concealment's actions, Hormick seemed to be in thought. Randall wore a look of calm and didn't believe that it posed any problems. In the underground ruins, on a strange metal pedestal, a ghostly blue beam soared up and formed a door. 4 black-armored guards immediately observed the situation outside through the ghostly blue beam and planned on using a predetermined method to confirm if the person who had summoned the door of teleportation was disguised, so as to decide whether the door was to be opened. However, they didn't see anything. The area outside was empty. Just as they felt intense unease and confusion, a figure quickly outlined itself behind them. It was none other than the leader of the Church of Evernight Ascetics, Ariana, who wore a patched robe. In the blink of an eye, the 4 guards fell into a deep sleep. Anthony, Randall, and Hormick entered the underground ruins one after another. They didn't directly follow the path down. Instead, they passed through the hall, floating in midair as they overlooked everything. This was a world ruled by darkness. Small amounts of light came from the strange moss growing in different spots, as well as the flaming torches that came from the human-sized buildings. With their illuminating light, even beyonders without night vision could grasp the overall appearance of the huge ruin. On one side was a gray rock wall. It extended upwards without an end, and it seemed to be connected to the ground. On the other side, there was a bottomless, dark valley, as if it were the abyss where devils lived. A road paved with stone slabs lay in the middle, connecting the halls and buildings together. From time to time, humans would come and go in silence. The archbishops of the three churches were just about to capture a few people who could enter the ruins to interrogate them about the situation inside, when a figure flew out of the dark valley, heading straight for the demigods. The figure had a long face and wore a white hairnet. 2 curly mustaches grew above his lips, and he had thick brows. His eyes were slightly bigger and looked rather similar to a certain poker card figure. He wore a gown and had a huge cloak over him. The tips of his shoes were extremely long, and his attire was unlike the current times. It was as though he lived 100 years ago. Archbishops like Anthony and Hormick were no stranger to him. He knew that he was Prince of Sonia, Grove Augustus, one of the demigods of the royal family.
How did you enter?
Grove asked first, his expression a little surprised and uncertain. They looked at each other, and Anthony took the initiative to say,
We've always been investigating the large number of mysterious disappearances, and we had locked onto MI9's Cunis Kilgore. Through him, we found this place.
Grove's expression changed slightly as he looked at the woman who left one's heart feeling tranquil. He deliberated and asked,
Ma'am Ariana.
Yes, I was in charge of the disappearance case.
Ariana answered succinctly. Prince Grove smiled bitterly.
We were too greedy. After discovering this ruin, we only thought of digging and retrieving the items inside. To keep it a secret, we even had certain connections with the demonist sect. Through the people they gathered, we built a passageway and held certain rituals. No, it's not what you think. They were just normal rituals, and they're still alive deep within the ruins. If you don't believe me, I can lead you down to take a look. Apart from the unopened seals and buildings, there's nothing.
Upon hearing his reply, Anthony, Hormick, and Randall exchanged looks, registering the puzzlement in each other's eyes. This was completely different from their expectations. This made them suspect that something was wrong. Things weren't as serious as they had imagined. At this moment, Ariana said,
You even created the Great Smog.
No, that was a lesson we learned from cooperating with the demonesses. They actually tried to control Idasak, and used him to gain control over the kingdom. After it was seen through by us, they created the Great Smog. From that moment forth, we broke all contact with them.
Prince Grove shook his head again. Having said that, he pointed below and frankly said,
How could we do such a thing just to secretly dig up the Blood Emperor's ruins? As long as you head deep down and closely examine it, you will understand what I mean. Heh, don't worry. With Ma'am Ariana around, no traps will work. Besides, ignoring the fact that we lack such power, even if we were able to secretly bury you in the ruins, the churches will discover a problem. I don't believe that you didn't report this matter to your respective holy sees before coming. If you don't return in a while, they will definitely take the corresponding actions.
Demigods like Randall and Anthony fell into thought as they cast their gazes at the simply dressed Ariana.
Okay.
Ariana calmly nodded. The angel and 3 saints then entered the depths of the ruins under the guidance of Prince Grove. They discovered that there was a ruin hidden in the darkness, with no man having set foot there, as well as men and women who had been taught to form different rituals. Everything was orderly and serene. Ariana, Hormick, and the other demigods acted according to their own thoughts and separately investigated the different regions. They even left and went further to investigate, but they failed to discover anything. After receiving Ariana's notice, Klein changed Cunis Kilgore into a servant inside the manor, making the MI9 deputy director vanish. Then, he unhurriedly held a sacrificial ritual. He sent the items he received above the gray fog for further research, patiently awaiting daybreak.